Good morning again and welcome back. I'm Ritu Agarwal. I'm a professor at the Smith School of Business. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next panel in the Emerging Markets Forum. I will be introducing the moderator as well as the panelists. The moderator for our panel this morning is Mr. Stephen Pearlstein, who I'm sure needs no introduction to this audience.
They don't read newspapers. You better introduce them.
Okay. Stephen Pearlstein is a business and economics columnist at the Washington Post. He's been at the Post since 1988 as the deputy business editor and subsequently served as the defense industry reporter, economics correspondent, and foreign correspondent based in Canada. He's also an associate editor of the Post and the moderator of the Post's On Leadership website, which you haven't, if you haven't visited, you must. It's an excellent collection of insights on what leadership means in the 21st century from leaders across different industries, businesses, etc. Mr. Pearlstein has won the most coveted prize for journalism, the Pulitzer Prize for Commentary, and he was the first business and economics writer to win the Pulitzer Prize in that category. In 2007, he also won the Gerald Loeb Award for commentary. His work has been honored by the Society of Business Editors and Writers. He has also often appeared in television and radio shows, including Meet the Press, This Week, PBS NewsHour, Charlie Rose, and numerous shows on MSNBC and CNBC. Mr. Pearlstein is from the state of Massachusetts, where he attended public schools. He graduated with a degree in American Studies from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and in the early 1980s, he was elected town moderator of West Newbury, Massachusetts. So welcome, Mr. Pearlstein. We are delighted to have him here as the moderator. We also have three very distinguished panelists today. Mr. Walter Bastian is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for the Western Hemisphere, U.S. Department of Commerce. He's responsible for developing programs, policies, and strategies designed to strengthen the United States' commercial position in the Western Hemisphere. And a top priority for Mr. Bastian is opening Latin American markets for U.S. companies so that they can continue the various themes that we heard in this morning's conversations around innovating and competing to build a stronger American economy. He's held a number of assignments related to Latin America at the Department of Commerce. Prior to that, he worked in a corporate trust department of a Washington bank and also served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Air Force. So he's had many different posts that he's held in his distinguished career. He's received numerous awards for his work, and most recently, he received the Presidential Rank Award, which recognizes his exceptional service to the American people over an extended period of time and his relentless commitment to excellence in public service. So welcome, Mr. Bastian. Also on the panel is John Haltiwanger. Dr. Haltiwanger is a distinguished professor of economics at the University of Maryland. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins in 1981. After serving on the faculty of UCLA and Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland was lucky enough to attract him. In the late 1990s, he served as chief economist of the U.S. Census Bureau. He is a senior research fellow with the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Program at the Bureau of the Census and a research associate of the Center for Economic Studies at the Bureau of the Census and the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has published widely and has written more than 80 academic articles and numerous books, including Job Creation and Destruction with Stephen Davis and Scott Shue from MIT Press, and Economic Turbulence, Is a Volatile Economy Good for America with Claire Brown and Julia Lane. So welcome, Dr. Haltiwanger. Our third panelist, Dr. Panagariya, is a professor of economics and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. Dr. Panagariya is also a very accomplished academician and has been writing extensively in economics and political science over the course of his career. He has been chief economist at the Asian Development Bank, a professor of economics and co-director, Center for International Economics, University of Maryland at College Park. Also worked at the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, UNCTAD in various capacities. His PhD is in economics from Princeton University. As with Dr. Haltiwanger, he has written several books. He's also written guest columns in the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Hindu, India Today, and Outlook, and appeared on numerous national and foreign television channels. Welcome, Dr. Panagariya. And with this, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Pearlstein, who is going to moderate the panel.
Thank you, and good morning. President Company accepted. We have a really distinguished panel here today, and hopefully we can do this in more of a conversational way and debating way rather than in a strict presentation way. But I would like to start by asking each of the panelists to maybe make one or two comments on the question that has been posed to us, which is, does the rise of new economic powers signal the decline in the West? I'll start off by noting that there were 2.5 billion people this morning watching a wedding in a former declining world power. So that I just want to say that, you know, you can last a long time after you're number one and get a lot of attention. I just point that out. That I don't know what the monetary value of that wedding was, but that was a lot of people watching an event in a country that supposedly doesn't matter anymore. But anyway, let's start with Arvind. Do you have some things you want to sort of lay on the table for our conversation on this question about whether the decline of the West is imminent?
Okay, so my specialization is India, so I'm really going to play up the India angle to this. But as you know, an opening statement, let me just say that rise of somebody doesn't necessarily imply the decline of the other. Everybody may be rising, except that some may be rising faster than the others. I certainly am not the one to subscribe to the view that the U.S. economy is about to fade away. I think there are certain strengths of the U.S. We had the global financial crisis, and therefore some turbulence here and so forth. But there's some fundamental strengths of the U.S. economy, which at least for the foreseeable future, which for me really is about next 15 to 20 years, will keep the United States in the lead. I think the biggest strengths I see is where I am, which is the universities. I don't think any of the countries in the world, whether growing at 10, 12, whatever percent, I'll come to that in a minute, has the kinds of universities anywhere near that the United States does. There are other strengths, but I think this is one where the United States is completely surpassed. Also, it does have the advantage of the rich consumers being here, and often a lot of the innovation that happens. Both the rich consumers being here and really the critical mass of the scientists that you need for fundamental research to happen. Also the large companies and so forth. So what you need for innovation to happen is all here, and so it's and insofar as this closeness, no matter how much internet and other electronic mediums develop, in the end, face-to-face contact is absolutely essential for a lot of the innovation to happen. Including the presence of the consumers where you operate. So I think the strengths of the United States economy are going to persist in the next 10 to 15 years. Now, having said that, I really do think that you got the emerging market economies coming in a big way, much bigger way than what we have seen today. And I'll just illustrate that with where I see India going in the next 15 years or so. So today, if you look at India, for instance, might say, why is all this hype? Because it still is a very poor country. Per capita income is about $1,200-$1,300 per year. It's probably not going to make it even to the ranks of the top 100 economies by the per capita income. Even by the GDP, the gross domestic product, India would be about 10th today. And so you might think, and if you look at the trade figures, it's less than 2% of merchandise trade. Services, it's maybe a little bit more, 3 to 4%. You might think, why the hype? But the hype is actually has a real basis for it, and that is the fact that in the last 8 years, India has been growing relatively rapidly in the last 30 years, but last 8 years, the growth has been just phenomenally high. It's reported, the widely reported figure is 8 to 9% in real rupees. That's in the local currency. But in fact, if you look at real dollar growth, growth in real dollars, it turns out because what has been happening during this period is also that the rupee has been appreciating in real terms against the dollar. So in real dollars, actually, the growth has been about 13% a year over these last 8 years. Now, even if you make the conservative assumption that India is going to grow at about 10% in real dollars, for which an excellent case can be made, and if there are issues, I can come back to it in the question answer session. But there's a great case to be made that minimally 10% growth in real dollars is almost certain to happen in the next 10 to 15 years. In 15 years, that takes India from its current size of about $1.7 trillion to $7 trillion. That makes India the third largest economy. That is something, also in terms of the rate of growth, I should mention, you may have seen this in the newspapers, correctly so. IMF has reported that in the calendar year 2010, in terms of the growth rate, finally India has edged out China. And I think this kind of is going to continue another 3 or 4 years. Certainly, India is going to, by whatever count you want to do it, I think IMF has got it right, actually. So India has already surpassed, but it will certainly surpass by everybody else's calculation also in 2 to 3 years. So that's one part of it, that you got this economy which is incredibly rapidly rising. So as an investor, you got to be into that economy. Just one more point I want to make here, which is going to impact us going forward in the next 15 years, which has to do with the demography. The demographic figures are that in the next 15 years, in the age group 20 to 49, this is the United Nations demographic predictions, which generally hold out. So in the age group 10 to 49, if you take the developed countries plus China, there is going to be minus 100 million people. In that age group, then this is the prime age group that is the working age group, the dynamic one, and so forth. India is going to be plus 130 million. So, if you already about 12% of the workforce is globalized as migrant labor force. This is going to become much larger. About 300,000 Indian students are studying around in the rest of the world, principally the United States, UK, Canada, and Australia. That number is going to explode, actually, and you'd see this labor force, the international labor force, the migrant labor force, becoming much larger. And so, if you think that people like me around you are too many today, you just have seen nothing yet. And this is going to really, be much larger going forward. Just because, you see this demographic transition in which 100 million people will be less between China and the developed countries, and 130 million more from India. So I think the face of the global economy is going to change. India and China certainly are going to rise. We think in terms of brick or bricks. I think main part of it is really the IC, which is the India and China. But the center of gravity certainly of the global economy is going to shift to Asia, because you'll then have 3 very large economies, China, India, and Japan, not to mention Korea. So we will see a major shift in the next 15 years. But again, I think US will still be the dominant economy, because it might still be in 15 years the largest economy by the GDP. But certainly when you figure also the per capita income, this will still remain the richest economy, and therefore driver of a lot of things that happen in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Arvind. We can all talk about this a little more, and I do want to talk about India, having just spent a couple of weeks there. You made an important point, which is, what do we care about? Do we care about absolute growth, or do we care about relative growth? Now, you said we all, India and China and the BRICS are rising fast from a lower point. We're up here, we're rising slowly, but, the gap between us is getting narrow, but we're still all proceeding up. Okay. Are there not some things for which it is important how relatively fast you're growing as opposed to absolute? You basically said Absolute growth is what you should care about. Absolute levels is what you should care about, not rates of growth. But on the other hand, do relative growth rates matter for some things economically?
No, of course, of course. I mean,
what do they matter?
So if I give the impression that it's only absolute that matters, no, this is not the intent.
No.
What I was saying was that the size of the U.S. economy and where in per capita terms it is still going to be a very important factor. That doesn't mean, it's certainly, the geopolitics is going to change. After all, it has already changed. Where India, how India was seen 10 years ago and it is seen today has changed. How China was seen 30 years ago and today, this dramatic.
I guess what I'm trying to get you to talk about is sort of self-reinforcing mechanisms. So, if a place is growing faster than another place, but it's still poorer, where do you want to be? Well, think about investment flows. Investment flows will go to the places where the growth is faster, not necessarily where the income is higher. Well, if there's a shift in investment flows, and that has something to do with then compounding what was already going on, so that the growth rate goes even faster in the faster growth rate places and slower in the slower growth rate places, so that it sort of feeds on itself. Should we worry about that in the slow-growing place?
Look, I mean, you're thinking perhaps of this as a zero-sum game, but it's not, because, the faster the, why did we actually come out of the current crisis relatively cheaply, I would say still? I understand there's a huge unemployment rate and so forth, and we have much more distance to go. But I think part of it has been that because the economy is globalized, and still there is one part of the global economy is growing so rapidly, that has helped us here in the US also. So if that was absent, actually, we would have been perhaps suffering a lot more and longer. So I see this as a positive-sum game. The fact that innovations begin to happen there also speeds up the innovations here. Now, so the implications I see of the bridging of the gap have more to do with the geopolitical stuff and all. But will our living standards be higher because that part of the world is growing more rapidly also? Certainly, yes. If that part of the world was also static, I think we would probably be experiencing much slower recovery here than what we have, even slower than what we have seen so far.
Let's come back to some of these things in a minute, but John, what would you like to lay on the table here?
So from my perspective, and kind of thinking about whether there are going to be, I'll call it winning and losing countries, that's kind of what we're sort of about. I actually think the place to start is to think about winning and losing firms. So here's what I think we know. We know the process of growth, I'll say literally in all countries, whether we're in the advanced economies or the emerging economies, is a process of creative destruction. And there will be winning and losing firms. That will be inevitable. And you could say, well, why is that? Why is it inevitable? Well, one fact that we've seen in looking at firm-level data, and now for just a large number of countries in both advanced and emerging economies, in very narrowly defined sectors, and this, for those in the business community here, you'll say, yeah, that's exactly what's going on, is in narrow sectors, we find large differences in productivity across businesses in the same sector. Very large differences. So just to give you a sense, the interquartile range typically inside a very narrowly defined sector is 30 to 50 log points. That's a huge difference. And so what often matters for whether an economy is doing well is it allowing the businesses that are the most productive businesses to grow and become the largest businesses? Okay? That's critical. That allocation process is what's critical. And so in terms of another piece of this, by the way, is that again, a large part of this sort of growth process being creative destruction involves experimentation. And business startups and entrepreneurs play a very important role in that experimentation and entrepreneurship process. But we also know something else about business startups. What's going to happen to most business startups? They're going to fail. And so you need an environment that's conducive for entry. You need an environment that's conducive for those entrants that turn out to be, I'll say, the winners, in the sense that they have the potential to grow, to, in fact, be able to grow. But you also need an environment in order for the disruption that goes along with all the shutdowns of those young, small businesses that's inevitable to not be too disruptive. And so now back to the winning and losing country sort of issue. So So who would I say are the winning countries? When does a country do well? Well, when it permits this process to work well. And I'd sort of say the U.S. has done probably the best, perhaps even in the whole world, particularly in the last 50 years. You might even say, particularly in, I'll say, the post-1980 era, because indeed, actually, Europe was kind of catching up with the United States, not surprisingly, again, because of the base they started from in the post-World War II era. But then, particularly in the last 30 years, the U.S. has been very dynamic, very flexible, and Europe has been less so. And so that's partly why there's been divergence rather than convergence over this period of time. So where do the emerging markets fit in? Well, 20 or 30 years ago, I think they'd say, I think probably Arvind would agree with this, and this is true of whether it's Brazil or India or China, these were the distortions in these economies were just enormous. And so what one found, and I have to admit the data I know best at the firm level is actually for China, so I'll talk a little bit about what I know about the Chinese data. As recently as the mid-1990s, we looked at the firm level data, and what we were struck by in China is very much unlike the United States, is that the biggest firms in China were the least productive businesses. They were large state-owned enterprises that were quite unproductive. And so if you have a country where there's a negative correlation between size and productivity, that country's in trouble, okay? Just a basic feature. So what's happened in these countries? They've opened up the door, not completely, I'd sort of say, but they've begun to open up the door for, I'd say, entrepreneurship on the one hand, and for restructuring and incentives so that productive businesses can grow and become large. And that turns out to be a critical factor. Are there risks in those countries? Yeah, I think they're still highly distorted economies. And the risk is, I'll say, in a period of time where there's rapid growth, you could say, why is there rapid growth? Because, again, they've opened up the door. And so we've got growth rates of this sort that Arvind talked about. But oftentimes there's bumps along the way. Something happens. The allocation decisions that they've made, either by the government itself, oftentimes those aren't such good decisions, or even by, as we know, looking at the allocative dynamics in the United States, sometimes we over-invest in certain kinds of areas, the dot-com bubble, obviously, being a good example. So the question is, how do you adjust and adapt to that? And a natural tendency for a government when you hit a bump is to try to help, obviously, and oftentimes that helping is, let's go help the incumbents, okay? Now, that often sort of dampens this process and increases the distortions in these sort of allocative dynamics that I'm talking about. So in terms of thinking about I'll say the U.S. versus the emerging markets, so the risks for the emerging markets are they going to be able to manage the bumps along the way? Are they going to be able to keep letting incentives improve rather than, are they going to, when they hit the bumps, are they going to lean against this? For the U.S., again, I'd sort of say, particularly in the last 30 years, there's strong evidence it's been a highly dynamic and flexible economy. And from that perspective, if the U.S. was able to kind of maintain its dynamism, there's no reason, as Arvind said, that the U.S. can't continue to grow and do quite well. This is not a zero-sum game. I will say, however, there are some signs the U.S. is becoming less flexible and less dynamic. I don't fully know why. I'd be happy to talk about it in more of a speculative way in the open discussion. But here's just a fact that kind of is somewhat troubling. There's been a secular decline in the pace of business startups in the United States in the last 30 years. Okay, so what's the lowest rate of business startups we've seen over the last 30 years? It's now. Okay, so that's not a good thing. Okay, and the U.S. has relied on being an entrepreneurial economy. And so the question is, why is that happening? I think it is a risk. So to sum up, in terms of thinking about winning and losing countries, is it inevitable that there will be winning and losing countries? I would say no, for the reasons Arvind said. This is not a zero-sum game. Is it inevitable there'll be winning and losing firms? Yes, that's inevitable. That's part of the process. By the way, do I think there will be winning and losing countries? Yes, I think that there will be. Why? Because some will manage this process much better than others.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'd like to bring up a country that probably isn't on the front of everyone's mind, but ask you, John, Japan. Can we explain the Japan lost 2 decades problem, putting aside the most recent tsunami, but 2 decades of lost growth in Japan. Can we explain that through the prism that you just have, which is not very good at displacing established, less productive firms with more productive?
First, let me say I don't think I'm an expert on Japan, partly because, by the way, Japan's not been very good at allowing folks like myself to get access to the firm-level data. But actually I've had students, particularly I'll say Japanese students, who've been fortunate enough to get access to such data to follow these dynamics. And I would say the answer is yes. Based upon their studies, indeed, the support of zombie firms over the last decade, lots of economists have found that's one of the drags on the Japanese system. So again, it's this, you find yourself in a crisis, and what's your tendency? It's to support the incumbents. Do I think the Japanese have been especially guilty of that? Yes, I do.
Let's talk about, let's get you to theorize a little bit about why low levels of company creation now. Obviously, there's some secular thing going on, but that probably doesn't explain it, because this is actually a very good time to start a business. Credit is cheap and probably actually readily available, and also there's a lot of people who got nothing else to do, whether it's to start a company or to work for such a company, so that would seem to offer opportunity. Why don't you speculate? I'm going to give you one idea, which is that if you look at the growth in the economy right now, business growth isn't bad. So why would that be? Why wouldn't small business growth and startup? Why would that be? Why wouldn't that be just as good? Well, if growing today means growing through exports or growing through having a global presence, doesn't that sort of raise the bar of getting into the business? If you want to get into the growing part of the business, you have to do business overseas. That's a higher hurdle than to say, I'm going to open up a pizza parlor and sell to people around my neighborhood. Is it sort of make the successful entry into business the bar a little higher if in fact that's what it means to succeed in a high-wage country like the United States?
I think that may be part of it. I do think more generally we've seen a shift in many sectors towards, I'll say, large national or large multinational companies. Now, by the way, is that necessarily a bad thing? I don't want to say it is at all. When that's happened, I'd sort of say typically it's for good reasons, for the reasons you talked about. In the retail trade sector, it's happened because actually the large national chains, the Walmarts of the world, they've organized production in a way that's been very efficient. No offense to the mom and pop stores out there, Walmart's much more efficient than the mom and pop stores at bringing goods to market. And so in that sense, if indeed there's sort of economic incentives for this, and so you could say there's sort of a benign reason, perhaps these sort of reasons, where maybe we shouldn't be so troubled. Maybe with the, in a globalized environment, and you could even make the argument in sectors like in retail trade that IT is actually, instead of helping the small businesses, actually help the Walmart. Their distribution network is taking advantage of information technology. So if those kind of shifts are going on, maybe this is not such a troubling trend, and so we shouldn't be so concerned. On the other hand, we've certainly seen in sectors historically, like autos and steel, when the U.S. was king of autos and steel in the 50s and the 60s. It struggled a lot when it hit the bumps in the road in those sectors, which were dominated by large national firms. And so, if large national firms are less nimble, that doesn't mean you want to limit that in any way, because indeed it's responding to appropriate economic incentives. But on the other hand, perhaps some risk in terms of just how nimble and flexible we are as an economy.
Mm-hmm. For a long time in the United States, the average size of a firm was going down, and that was also true in most sectors. Has that started to flatten out and go the other way?
Yeah, it has, particularly in some sectors, is the answer.
Which sectors?
Well, retail trade is the most dominant sector where that's happened, and so.
And so one reason it was going down, one could theorize, was that because of technology, technology was making it possible for smaller units to be efficient. And that kind of technology was previously not available to small companies. just take the computer, for example. You used to have a mainframe to have any computer. That meant you had to be a certain size. If all of a sudden you go to smaller computers, then anyone can have a computer, then any company can use technology and become efficient, so therefore maybe size wasn't such a big deal. That explained a lot of it. Is it possible that we've gotten to the point of technology where that advantage to being a little smaller has now gone away, and now other economies of scale are reasserting themselves?
Well, I would say let's take your point. I like the point about the impact of technology. I actually think what technology is doing is changing the whole organization of production. So it's enabling us, I would say, to fragment production in ways that they're sort of unprecedented.
Right.
So outsourcing and offshoring is a form of fragmentation. Right. And indeed, one of the things that I have a lot of connection with the state agencies, they're realizing increasingly that where a business says it's located and where its workers are is becoming much less connected, because programmers are sitting anywhere in the world almost, or in terms of helping them out, or call centers are sitting anywhere in the world. Now, so on the one hand, I think we will sort of see an ability of kind of, I'll say, a disconnect between you could sort of say, central location of production, okay, and the location of the resources. In some ways, that's actually going to favor, I'll go ahead and say, large businesses that can find their way, can fragment the pieces of production successfully. So that it may be, by the way, that again the distinction between even small and large. I don't think we understand this very well, because it may be that what we mean by a large business is they're calling on resources from literally all over the globe, some of which they have related party relationships with, and others that they've contracted out with.
So the model that I like to think of is, imagine, going back 30 or 40 years to a large corporation, okay? And they ran their own data center, they did their own marketing and advertising, they ran their own cafeteria, they ran their own security department. Now, all that stuff and much, much more is outsourced to firms, many of which are smaller.
That's right.
Okay? So that's how we had a lot of small business creation through that outsourcing process. Now, two things have happened. Number one, about as much that can be outsourced has been outsourced. I think we're getting to a sort of a flattening of the curve of potential there. The second thing is, when you first outsourced back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, you outsourced often to a small local company. Now, so what happened is, and this happened in a lot of firms, you outsourced the security. So who did you outsource it to? Well, actually, you outsourced it to the guy who used to run your security department, who rehired everyone who you were at in the security department. Now, who do you outsource the security to? Wackenhut, a large global corporation. So that where there used to be, looked like there was efficiencies to outsourcing to small, now there are efficiencies, because Wackenhut figured out how to get efficiencies of scale for running security desks. Okay, now we have outsourcing to large. And I'm just wondering whether there hasn't been sort of a flattening out of the opportunity for small business in the future. And I'm not really talking about small Silicon Valley startups. I'm talking about fairly prosaic kind of businesses.
So perhaps I should just say I agree, but I want to kind of bring it back to some of the themes I was talking about, which is part of growth is sort of changing the way we do business.
Right.
Okay, and the countries that will do well are those that have the creativity and the flexibility to reorganize themselves along different dimensions. And as you just nicely did, was what worked in the 70s and 80s may not work, obviously, and probably will not work in the next couple of decades. And that's one of the challenges here. So back again to this, what I talked about, these big differences in productivity. So one thing we're struck by when we look at the firm level data is there's persistence in productivity. If you're in the United States, if you became large, I'll say, for the right reason for the most part. You didn't become large because you got the allocation from the government. You became large because you were amongst the most productive and profitable. So there's a lot of persistence, but it's not that high. Okay, so staying at the top's not so easy. And we can come up with a long list of companies, and I'll call it company organization structures that worked well in the 50s but don't work well now, that worked well in the 70s that don't work well now. So the challenge is, do you have the flexibility to reorganize and restructure, whether it's shifting one direction or shifting another direction, as you were talking about?
Okay. So Walter's focus is going to be on I think this hemisphere, and what would you like to say on the question of does the rise of new economic powers in, say, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile signal the decline of the West?
Look, if I could first comment on something you said, the downside, large companies going out and diversifying their workforce. My wife works for HP. Her client happens to be, through HP, happens to be a large concern in Europe, which means that she goes to bed about 2 o'clock or gets up about 3 o'clock in the morning, goes to bed at 8. So it might be good for business as hell in your marriage. So I think part of, I found this fascinating, and just some comments. The way I think that we look at it, and keeping in mind, I've been in government for a lot of years, and you know, when I started working, we never talked about foreign investment in the United States. That was taboo. You know, you wanted only U.S. investment. You never talked about two-way trade. You never talked about a free trade agreement. You wouldn't dare do it. And so I think, but keeping in mind that the government, the bureaucracy that's establishing the policies, we're like an aircraft carrier in a sense, you know? You can't just, we're not a ski boat. You know, you can't say, hey, you know, to port or to starboard. I mean, and expect it to happen very quickly. It takes a long time to change the course of this big vehicle. But I think we've come a ways. I think, you know, we throw out a statistic, or statistics, because I know you're a statistician, but...
Careful. He's an economist.
Economist, excuse me, okay. But
I don't find it insulting to be called a statistician.
But, you know, so whether the number is 90 or 95% of the consumers live outside the U.S. borders, that's the number we like to throw out. Doesn't mean that they can all afford to buy. But the fact is that there are huge markets on the outside, and I think it's taken us a while to realize that. We've also had a real problem on the political side. You know, if you went back when I started working in the I don't want to say how long ago, but a long time ago, it was almost a black and white issue. You were with us, you were against us. You had the competing model in the Soviet Union. That failed. But you still had governments to the right, governments to the left, or to the right and to the left. How does, and we've had to change our point of view. And in this hemisphere, you can take a look at a country like Brazil with a left-of-center government. You can take a look at a country like Chile with a certainly right-of-center government. You can take Uruguay with a president that was really far to the left of center. And what we find is their economic policies are really kind of centrist. They got a good idea of where they're going. I was really quite taken with the conversation that I had with President Mujica of Uruguay. President Mujica was an extreme leftist. He was the founder of the Tupamaro guerrilla movement, which was worse than Shining Path. And today's the Honorable Mr. President. But he said to me, what I'm looking for, I want to put policies in place that are going to attract foreign investors. I want to give them the security because foreign investors come in, and by and large, they pay taxes to allow me to run the social programs that I want to run. So, you know, I don't have to do it with a gun. I can do it, you know, the right way with improving standards of living and, you know, not taking lives in the process. So in this hemisphere, what we take a look at, what our priorities are right across the street at the Department of Commerce. The President has announced the National Export Initiative. So that's the umbrella. And it's pretty simple in word terms, and that's doubling exports within 5 years. That's the easy part of it. Then how do you actually accomplish that? And part of what we're focusing on in large measure are the free trade agreements. We have 2 pending, and I'm not going to give you a commercial, promise. But we have 2 pending, one with Panama and one with Colombia. And the reason that we think these are valuable, if you take a look at, people talk a lot about the trade imbalance, trade deficit. Take a look at our trade deficit. We have a positive trade balance. If you take oil, excuse me, you're always taking something out of the equation. Taking oil out of the equation. But we have a favorable trade balance with the 17 countries with which we have free trade agreements. We have huge deficits, by and large, with the others. So we do see benefit in these. But we're looking right now, Canada and Mexico are very important for us. The volume of business that goes back and forth across our southern border is about $500,000 a minute. And that's pretty impressive. What's it with Canada? It's double that. It's $1 million a minute. Now, some of that is product that's going up to Canada and coming back here because, you know, being worked on in Canada. I happen to drive a GMC SUV, not a commercial for GMC. But in the process of making that vehicle, goes back and forth across the border 7 times. You know, our economies are really intertwined. But so it's those two. These are well-established, mature markets for the United States. How do we get even more business in? How do we get the small businesses that haven't exported before involved in exporting? Well, a pretty easy one to take a look at, relatively easy one, is Canada. Beyond that, it's Brazil for us. One of the BRICS, they talked about India, you talked about China, 2 countries I know very little about. But with Brazil, we have an opportunity right now. We have a government that's, I'm not going to say it's a really pro-US government, but where we think we can develop a very good, solid relationship based on trade, based on exchanges in science, or a number of things that we can do with the Brazilians. And Brazil is the economy in South America. 26 states in Brazil, I think that's the number they've got. The state of Sao Paulo alone is about 40% of the GDP of South America. So that tells you, that's pretty damn impressive. That's pretty strong. You mentioned Argentina. Okay, now while I talk, Chile's a country that does things well, and Brazil is doing things well. And
Argentina does things terribly, but they have more fun than people in either other place.
You took my line. But you're absolutely right.
And they have a better standard of, they have a better life than.
They have a better life, but what the Argentines managed to do is they have a good thing going, but they put up roadblocks
Yeah, they're
at every
great
point.
at that.
So right now, they do things, you were talking about a Walmart. Okay, the government of Argentina, the president has just announced that she's going into the supermarket business.
In Argentina?
In Argentina. And so she's going to compete against the Walmarts and the others.
Yes.
Yes, my sentiment exactly. They have a tax that, excuse me, they've just implemented a non-automatic import licensing system. So this is to give local businesses a chance to compete, where they manufacture something that competes against a foreign product, giving the benefit and the protection to the domestics. Well, they don't think this thing through really well. So
It's the Italy of South America.
it is the Italy of that. Never mind.
Sorry.
I won't go there. So I called the president of the Chamber of Importers in Argentina. I said, you know, is this really a burden on you? And he said, it's horrible, because you can wait 9 months to a year to be able to get a product in. But he said, you think I've got it bad? Call the Exporters Association, because they need those inputs to put into product that they're going to export. And so their ability to compete on high-tech items in particular is non-existent. So just one more thing, if I might. Going back to your point, and I work for the Department of Commerce, and I know trade's the most important thing in the world, and yes, FTAs are important and so forth. I do think that the biggest stumbling block is education. It really, we've got a good system here, but if you take a look at articles that have been written and books that have been written on the subject, particularly in Latin America, the education system, I don't know how else to put this, but in today's language, you'd say it sucks. There's no other, just can't be too blunt about it. The concept of private sector funded academic research doesn't exist. You have universities. If you take a look at the Financial Times list every year of top 200 universities, in 2007 they had 1. Last year I think they had 2. But they produce a lot of economists, political scientists, poets, writers, but you don't have the skills that you need, the research chemists and the physicists that put a man or a woman on the moon. And so they're coming up here to do that. And by frequently staying up here or going to another developed country to sell their services. So I think that's, and I'll finish that. I was at a program in Miami recently on Haiti, which poses no threat to us at the moment. Right. And the moderator said, well, yeah, education's a problem, but we don't have to worry about elementary school education, or we don't have to worry about middle school or high school. What we need to do is to produce more PhDs. You say, well, I don't know how the hell you get there if you don't have a good system, feeder system going up to it, but that may explain a lot. Anyway, I'll finish there.
It's an extreme case. Now, you've said something that government officials from the Department of Commerce and the Trade Representative's office always say, which is we have a positive balance with all those countries with whom we have free trade treaties. Now, that's a true statement. Now, that one implication of that could be that we should have free trade treaties with more countries, and therefore we would have more positive trade balance. That's one inference. But there's another inference you could draw from that, which is we've been very smart about who we've had free trade treaties with, and that we have them with people who will in fact trade with us, as opposed to having free trade treaties with people such as China, who really won't trade with us, who will only send us things but won't buy our things. And so you could draw two inferences from your data. One is the inference you want us to draw, which is let's have more free trade treaties. The other is let's be careful. We've had the free trade treaties with the logical people to have them with, Mexico and Canada, for example, people who will in fact trade with us. But let's be careful about extending free trade treaties to countries that really don't want to have trade. They want to have an export location. So what would you say to that?
Well, I think, first of all, for people that aren't familiar, we call these agreements free trade agreements, and they're more than a free trade agreement. This is a business agreement, because this covers absolutely every aspect of doing business in a foreign country or for them to do business in the United States. So it is trade, it's tariffs, it's customs, it's intellectual property protection, it's investment protection, it's dispute resolution, it's labeling, it's standards, on and on and on. They're very, and we have not yet approached a country saying we want to negotiate with you. They come to us and say they want to negotiate with the United States.
Well, so did China. And what we got was a one-way deal.
But what we don't do, what they haven't done, the agreement to open their market is not something that most countries by and large want to do. And so what happens is, and let me just give you an example. Some of the countries that we have negotiated with, particularly Central America, Dominican Republic, Colombia, and Panama, already had preferential access to the United States. Their products already came in duty-free to the United States. So they're smart enough to say, well, you ask yourself, well, if they've already got this special treatment coming into the United States, being treated pretty much like a U.S. company, why do they even want to open up their market to the United States? Because they want the foreign investment. And it's not just investment from the United States, but when you negotiate a free trade agreement with us, we require, by and large, that almost all the concessions that you make be in law. It takes a constitutional action to actually make these things take effect. And that's reassuring not just to U.S. investors and business executives, but also to the Europeans and others that say, because these are in law, so by and large are going to apply to everybody. So, that's the reason that they want it. But the reason that we pick is, we want like-minded governments, or even if there's some differences, countries that will, I don't know how else to put it, but basically come in line with what it is we're looking for.
So let me ask a few general questions, and I see we're getting near the end of our time. So, Arvind, we should at least engage the big question, which is, growth of emerging markets ought to be a win-win situation according to neoclassical economics, to which you and John must subscribe because you have PhDs in economics. So it has to be a win-win. Now, a lot of people are not thinking about it in those terms. They're thinking about it win-lose. And they see some fairly concrete evidence of where they're losing. They or their neighbors are losing. So how are we going to deal with that question? And in particular, if you're dealing in a world in which suddenly billions of unemployed and underemployed people have entered the global labor market, wouldn't you agree that at least for some period of 10 to 20 years, that if that supply increases suddenly and is available to the global labor market, that it's going to have an effect on the wages and even the employment rates, because the system isn't perfectly frictionless. of those people who are in the high-wage countries.
Yeah, but look, I mean, when they enter the market, they are not entering purely as suppliers of products.
Right,
they're also entering as consumers.
Yes.
So, attached to employment is the wage income, which they spend. And so it's not entirely clear to me that part of it, that it is necessarily that it is going to put the pressures on wages elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Indians like all the US products. They like to travel to the US. Chinese do the same. So, it's certainly not the kind of zero-sum game that one is kind of,
not as
instinctively
willing to. I'm just thinking it's maybe a little imbalanced, that's all.
Look, I mean, as John has said, you will get winners and losers. But question is that, in the end, do you want a system in which we see progress, or we want a system in which we stagnate? I mean, I fully agree with John, actually, that, the US institutions in these respects have been much more flexible. And do not forget, I mean, even during this period during which we have opened up enormously, take, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. Mm-hmm. The US economy, by all measures, is much more open. Is it less prosperous today on that account? Has it had more unemployment on that account? Now, wage shifts happen, but wage shifts, do not forget, large parts of the wage shifts have also happened because of the technological shift. The innovations have tended to be much more demanding of skills versus the less skilled. And certainly that, there is, go to any country, in fact, if there is a problem, if there is poverty, you want to kind of, you talk to, I operate a lot in India, and the first thing people say, which completely flies in the face of every piece of evidence, but nevertheless, subscribe to, that, oh, we got so much poverty because we opened up, because we did this liberalization. So really, we got we've been growing at 10%, but look, because there's 300 million people living in abject poverty. Obviously, there's got to be the fault of, but think of the counterfactual. There would have been 500 million people living in abject poverty had it not been for the kind of growth that has happened.
But is it possible, is it theoretically possible, is it true in reality, that if you open up, that on both sides, both in India and in the United States, that one effect of that, at least over the short and medium term, is that incomes become more unequal in both places. That is, the rich get rich relative to the poor in both places.
Look, I mean, I'm a trade theorist. That's my honest living. And you give me the result, I'll write a model that will produce that kind of result. So the question you really have to ask is whether that is the relevant model. Mm-hmm. And so the question has to be the empirical one. And then do not forget that the technological change itself is endogenous. Would we have had the kind of technological explosion that we have had without the economies having been opened up?
No, but that goes to the other point of view, saying technology is the cause of this. But you are right. The only reason one of the reasons technology has been adapted so quickly is because of globalization. So does globalization cause quicker adaptation of technology, or does technology cause globalization? Of course, the answer is both.
It's interactive. It's interactive. I agree with that. And insofar as improvements in technology, certainly they will also create distributional effects. There's no doubt. And my view is that has created some distributional significant part of the distribution.
In both developed.
In both, but no, not necessarily though that it is in the wrong side. So the distributional impact can also go in the right side. But in the US, certainly there's a period during which it appears to me that the distributional impact of technological change was to actually lower or at least arrest the wages of the unskilled. Mm-hmm. That is, I think, now beginning to change a bit, but certainly there was a period.
John, I wanted to ask you about the role of US-based multinationals. Should we think of them as companies that are, in general, enhancing prosperity in the United States, or should we think of them as companies that are, by and large, shifting capital and work away from the United States to, they are accelerating the difference in growth rates, essentially. They are turbocharging fast growth overseas, and they are in a sense, also contributing to slower growth here?
Well, there's no doubt that I'll say globalization in general and multinationals in particular are part of the, I'll call it the creative destruction process. It's part of the changing way of doing business. And there are going to be, that's where the tension comes from. You say we're kind of card-carrying economists, and so we sort of believe in the neoclassical model that all will work out. But we certainly understand there will be disruptions and dislocations. And so is globalization, and I put it more there rather than because the large multinationals are responding to the incentives associated with globalization. And should they respond to those incentives? Yeah, that's actually exactly what we want. We want, indeed, businesses that have good ideas, productive, profitable ideas, to take them up. All right? And I'll sort of say if indeed, as this happens, other businesses will find opportunities to take advantage of other sort of opportunities. So let's follow up on something Arvind said. So on the one hand, over the last 20 or 30 years, I'll say technological change has been skill biased. Has that always been true? No, actually, I'd sort of say not. So Larry Katz and Claudia Golden look over 100 years, and they sort of remind us Henry Ford and indeed that kind of technological change actually went the other way. All right. So if indeed, I'll say globalization, technological change, these working interactions have indeed sort of shifted towards what you're talking about, smart entrepreneurs in the United States, if it's a sufficiently flexible system, will find ways of taking advantage of the resources in the United States. That's what we want. We want to make sure that indeed the business climate is such that people will say, look, there's an opportunity here, let's take it up.
Should we be rooting for the kinds of businesses that were represented in the previous panel more than the success of those businesses more than we should be rooting for the success of multinationals which are sort of agnostic about whether they grow here and anywhere else?
We should be rooting for high productivity businesses. And do I think the government has much of a role in terms of being able to identify who those businesses are? No, I think the government is no better than most of us. Markets are constantly, that's what markets are all about, constantly trying to find who those businesses are. So we should be rooting for a system that allows the most productive global businesses to do well, and for the entrepreneurs, the young startups. And indeed, again, we've got, can I say, the evidence for the United States is we get enormous job and productivity growth out of business startups on the one hand, and two, out of those business startups, as I said, most of them fail, but the ones that succeed, the relatively small fraction that succeed, they grow very fast and they add lots of productivity in terms of sort of the growth rates. So can I say we should be rooting for both, and a system that enables, again, I'll say the winners to win. And enables, I'll go and say that's the hard part is, there is going to be disruption. And the tendency is, of course, when you see such disruption, how can you not? Business failure is a complicated thing. Particularly when you hit what we sort of seen in the last few years. You could say in the last few years we've kind of gotten the destruction part right, but not much creation. Okay, so it's been creative destruction. It's been destruction, not enough creation. When that happens, we're in trouble. Does the government have an important role to play there? I think that's right. In other times, like and this is the challenge for my colleague here from the Department of Commerce and right across the street is, how do they provide the right business climate to make this happen? On the one hand, I very much like the idea of, and I've got Arvind sitting here who's like a world expert on trade agreements, so I don't want to go down there, but thinking about what sort of trade agreements we should have in place. That seems the right thing to do. This exporter policy, I'm worried about it a little bit. Is it the case? Is it the case we sort of said, oh, what we would like to do is have small businesses export? Is that the right strategy? I don't think that's the right strategy necessarily at all. What we've seen in the data is exporting is very rare. Almost no firms export. Okay, and even of those that export, most of the exports are accounted for by these really large companies that you sort of started with. Do we want to change that? No, I actually don't think we want to change that. Does that mean we don't want a system that allows, again, these young, small businesses, these entrepreneurs, to take off? We often call the gazelles. Yeah, actually, we do want a system that allows that to happen. And some of them will do one of two things. They'll become one of the big companies that actually is exporting, or maybe they'll get acquired by one of the big companies that's exporting.
Yeah. Walter.
I just want to comment because I agree with what you say. The role of government, I don't think, is to pick the winners and losers. That's not our job. I think our job is to create a framework within which companies can operate, because the truth of the matter is most of us in government have never had to meet a payroll or hire or fire anybody. That's not what we do. So it's the business climate that you're talking about. And you're absolutely right on your point on small business and exporting. And I don't think that the 5% of our firms export, and the percentage of that's a small business. And you're right, so pizza parlors you were talking about, there's no export potential there. It just ain't going to happen. But I think we need to create that environment that does say, if you're interested in this, and these are some of the opportunities, we create that environment that they can flourish in. And I think our job is to create that framework and also to do what we can to foster innovation and set up competitive environments for companies. And that's my message.
I just wanted to add to what John said about creative destruction, and it seems that with the financial sector becoming so extremely large, I think we had a bit of a destructive creation there.
Yes.
And
a misallocation of talent and capital.
Yeah, but also destructive creation. Some of the instruments that got created, not quite sure whether they were adding the value to the or subtracting from.
I think we know now that they were subtracting from, don't we?
But
well, so let's open it up for questions for a bit. And I guess there's microphones. There's a young gentleman in the back there.
Hi, so good afternoon. Thank you for the panel. My name is Paul Vanderboer. I have a question. In about 3 hours, the Endeavour, the space shuttle is going to take probably the last launch, or definitely the last launch of its history. And about 50 years ago, the United States entered in the space race, which sort of set off, or continued the leadership of the United States in the world. And I was wondering, United States astronauts are going to be launched from mostly Soyuz or Russian-made rockets, and I was wondering, to what extent was this? I mean, I know this is actually not the fault of any of these what we call emerging economies. What has happened to Russians? It's not the fault of the Indians, and it's not the fault of the Chinese.
Yeah.
So, to what extent, what we see today is what we call the decline of the West, or what we're discussing in the panel. Yeah. To what extent was that not the fault of the rise of the other countries, but what was happening inside the United States?
Okay. I want to answer your question, but I'm going to answer it last. Anyone else want to take a stab at that?
I'll take a little stab. I think it's a really hard. Can I say a really hard question? It's about, can I say, the role, I'll say, of government in innovation and research and development and so on. So Arvind talked about, and I think I have a bias here. I'm a university professor that gets benefits from this. So the appropriate point is that the U.S. development, I'll say U.S. investment in basic R&D has contributed to the system that Arvind talked about. So we certainly have the best graduate education in the world. We are a magnet for the best and the brightest. And some of them return to their countries, but we produce an enormous amount of talent out of our graduate education. And has the U.S. benefited from this? Yes. And so I'm sort of, do I think that investment into basic R&D has been huge? Now then, in some sense, you could regard the investment in the space program as a form of a targeted innovation in R&D. Getting that right is hard. I'm not an expert enough on aerospace, so whatever. Is it possible, I don't want to say through blind luck, but is it possible that governments get that right occasionally, that they have a targeted R&D innovation program that pays off big time? Yeah, it's actually possible. Do I think that's probably the right general approach? Probably not.
Okay, go ahead.
I just want to, don't worry too much. I mean, obviously you're somewhat concerned about the loss of our space shuttle capability, but to talk about the value of education in this and the role that one of the emerging powers is playing is a joint venture between Rensselaer and NASA. And they've already got the prototype for the development of the laser-launched space shuttle, which will clearly be the next generation, and which nobody else will have, just as an example.
I would just point out to you that, and I don't mean this, I just mean this as a sort of factual thing. In the old days, when we launched guys into space, they were launched on on rockets that were made by companies that are now owned by General Dynamics and Lockheed Martin. Those companies today are bigger than the companies before. They sell more things, and in fact, they mostly make weapons, which we can have a moral argument about that, but they make a lot more money making those weapons and selling them all over the world, including to India and China, though not as much to India as we would like this week, and not so much to China either, but we sell them to everybody. We are the master of selling sophisticated weapons, and the Russians aren't doing so good. So we got the better business. If they get the rockets and we get the guided missiles, we did better in the trade than they did.
But just this is also an issue of product cycle, life cycle of the product.
We're good
this is
at the
now
early
old
trade.
technology, and it goes there.
Yeah.
I mean, we invented television. We no longer produce television.
Right.
It's that kind of cycle. So, radiology, people get very exercised that, some 4 doctors were reading these X-rays in India. But, the frontier radiology research is all here. So,
But I would say that this brings up an important point, that when we have these conversations, this is a political economy point, it's very hard to have them. When you say the dollar goes down and people say, that's bad. Well, actually, it's not so bad. It's actually good. But it sounds bad, your currency goes down. Or we no longer make the rockets. It sounds bad. We can't make those rockets anymore. It sounds bad. We can't even make the televisions anymore. It sounds bad. But it's not bad. But when we talk about these things just sort of in a conversational way, they do sound bad. And it's very hard in politics and having a political conversation to get over those things because the instinct is to think that they are bad.
Yeah.
Sir.
So I would like to touch on one of the points that came out in the last point. So both Arvind and John agreed that this is not a zero-sum game. I would like to have some reflections from the panelists on this idea that to what extent in this topic does the rise of new economic power signal the decline of West? There is an element of self-fulfilling prophecy. So if we continue to restrict, so Arvind mentioned that we will have 130 million people, new, let's say, highly skilled people, but then the US government's policies are now restricting those high-skilled people coming from here. So if we are, let's say, putting those people in those economies, we are saying, guys, you stay in China, you stay in India, don't come here, then in a way, we are creating this self-fulfilling prophecy, and we will actually then get to this point of zero-sum game rather than realize the positive-sum game. Any reflections, any thoughts on that? And what you think should US be doing to not let that happen, to not let that zero-sum game happen, and promote that idea of positive-sum game?
Yeah, no, I mean, this gets into obviously the immigration issue, and in the U.S., once you are inside the border, everybody can be, potentially an immigrant. So, there's a whole set of immigration-related issues that go with that. But my personal view here is the U.S. being far-sighted here. Are we being far-sighted here in terms of the skilled labor policies? Perhaps not. I mean, the small little things that got done very recently about H-1B visas, the U.S. committed to 65,000 visas in the Uruguay round, which is a legal commitment, really. And then we go back today and raise the fees to, levels from something like $200 to $2,500. It doesn't send a good signal. It's not going to change very much. I think there is enough incentive there, so 65,000 will still continue to come in on H-1B visas. But it just sends a very wrong signal, bad signals to the trading partners that it's effectively kind of erodes the commitment that was actually made. So I think we could be more open, certainly insofar as the skilled labor is concerned, it is to our benefit. I don't think we can open the borders, but certainly we can go much farther than we have.
One more question, I think.
Hi, Larry Gordon from the Smith Business School. One of the points that was mentioned about multinationals being US-based, the interesting thing that I find in talking with senior executives in the really top companies is they no longer talk about themselves as being multinationals, U.S.-based. They talk very much along what John said. They talk about themselves being a global company. They go where the growth is. Productivity is the key factor. And actually, they have a much broader perspective than this notion of us against them or something like that. In fact, these people, these executives are always going back and forth. One month they could be in this country, another month they're in China. And so I think that's really a healthy development that's taking place and will bring the countries together. So it's really just a comment that I heard several things about we against us, them, and the notion of being a multinational U.S.-based. That's not how they talk at all. They really don't talk that way at all, at least the people I meet all the time. So you might want to just comment, but John's very much along the lines of what you said.
Well, I agree that they have become that way, and I'm probably the one you want to have be your interlocutor on that question. That's exactly the way they think. But then, when they start giving policymakers advice about what is good for the United States, we should understand that they actually have no particular dog in the fight about what is good for the United States. I mean, they could care less about what's good for the United States. All they care about is what's good for their company and perhaps for the world system that allows their company to thrive, but they actually don't care whether we win, anyone loses, or our relative growth rate goes up more than anyone else. They almost have now admitted that they don't care, right? So we shouldn't give much weight to what they say. When they say, you should do this for us because it's going to be good for you in the United States, we should really hear what they say is it's good for us at GE. Well, no, they're not concerned. They've already told us that. Okay, so we've now gone from a world in which what's good for General Motors is good for America is now what's good for the global economy is good for America. That's sort of what you're saying. In the long run, that's exactly where we'll end up, right?
Okay. But look, I mean, I can think of many multinationals now, even from India, who are thinking the way General Motors is thinking or General Electric is thinking. So, this is not, again, a one-way thing happening.
I'm not suggesting it is. The problem is that when we take policy advice from people who are playing a cute game, they say, I'm an American, I'm giving you policy advice, Mr. President. But they're not Americans for that purpose. And that's, I think, that's something we have to be careful about. We should take our, we should give such weight to their advice as we think it deserves, but we should remember that they are not thinking primarily how to increase the incomes of the people of the United States. That's not their goal.
So in other words, if I extend your argument, if Tatas tomorrow are playing a big role in the U.S. economy, we should start taking advice from the Tatas? Tatas is the Indian multinational.
I would say we should take the advice from the head of General Electric and give it the same weight as Mr. Tata. Exactly the same, no more and no less, because both of them care equally about the particular fortunes of the United States, which is zero.
So I would say two things. One is, I actually don't think, for the most part, we should care who owns companies. I don't think that's clear, whether they're U.S.-owned or foreign-owned. We should care about whether we have a business climate so that businesses want to create value in the United States. So I think that's the key issue, regardless of ownership. Having said that, I agree with Steve that when we get into the policy arena, you got to be careful. Can I say one of the things that if we, why do I think some of the European economies are less dynamic and flexible? Because large incumbents found ways of convincing their governments, okay, they weren't quite the companies Steve was talking about, to do things to make things better for them. Do I think large companies do that all the time? You betcha. All right, and so is it the case that they're the ones that should have the ears of the policymakers, and we should say, oh yeah, this is a good idea because it's going to be good for us? We got to be very careful about that. That's one of the kind of things that sort of dampens our ability to be dynamic and flexible. And you know, I'll go ahead and say the one group, I'll go ahead and say that often is not whispering in the ears of policymakers are the entrepreneurs and the startups, because they're not even there. Okay, and so if that's true, well, we got to be careful about this, the kind of environment that Steve's talking about, where indeed everybody's, you know, we're in Washington after all. We're right here between the White House and the Congress. Is that an issue? I think it's a big time issue.
Can I just add one thing?
Okay. Yes. And then we have one more question.
Okay. I come somewhere down the middle on this one.
You have to.
Yeah, that's right.
No, but I believe this. I'll give you. I think that the federal government or the United States needs advice from the private sector. I firmly do believe that. And I'll go back to my point. We're not business executives, okay? Yeah. I mean, we don't know how to run a company. Yeah. And left to us, and I'll give you, this is an example. We have, with Brazil, we have something called the U.S.-Brazil CEO Forum. It's 10 U.S. CEOs from Fortune 500 companies and the Brazilian equivalents. So it's Embraer, it's Valle, it's Odebrecht. I mean, these are huge global companies. So when we sit down and figure out what they're going to be advising the governments on, we already have our list. We know what they're going to come to us with. First is, because I work for the Department of Commerce, but it's first on our list all the time, intellectual property protection. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they come up with a list of 10 things, the business executives jointly. And we've got our list. Intellectual property protection wasn't on their list, period. What was number one for them were visas. The ability to move workers back and forth, potential clients back and forth. So we need, and there's some things, correctly pointed out, that we can do something about, and we should do something about. When they come back and say, lower the corporate tax rate, well, that's probably not going to happen, okay? But we need the advice on some things that we can do to make that business environment better.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ashok Rao. I'm working for a 4G wireless company in Northern Virginia. I'm also an entrepreneur on the side, so I actually had a comment on that speculation on startups. But before I go there, just wanted to say that I'm glad that the topic here is the decline of the West and the rise of the new economic powers, because Andy Grove basically said, right, only the paranoid survive. So it's when you stop having such forums, that's when, we should start getting scared, right? So coming back to the, I would speculate, and I've gone for a number of venture capital events in the DC area, and it's amazing at the lack of interest from VCs these days. There's been a real decline in financing, and the reason really being is the VCs cannot exit. They have a lot of portfolio companies. They just haven't been able to make it. 9 out of 10 startups fail. And that has led to a real problem here. And related to that is the fact that, at least in the technology sector, so just focusing on startups, technology startups, the amount of money needed to actually get a startup going is fairly high in the US. It costs you maybe $100,000 to hire a software programmer, maybe a little less, and you need at least a few of those. So you're looking at a $3 to $4 million almost investment. And the VCs are saying that unless you have $5 million in revenue, we're not prepared to fund you. So and it is a problem, because in the rest of the world, I mean, if you go to Bangalore, you can hire 25 people working for you, and you can probably get a startup going in a fraction of that kind of investment. So I think, again, we can debate about the government involvement in this, but there has to be a mechanism for seed capital, and there is the SBA and there's other things, but I haven't seen anything really coming out of the government to help there. And I don't know what the answer is, because again, this is, you don't want the government to be too involved, but on the other hand, a completely hands-off approach is probably not the right. So ultimately, I think I would speculate that at least in the technology sector, one of the reasons for decline of startups really is the whole financing issue. Thank you.
Well, this is a perennial debate, and I'm so thrilled that you didn't blame Sarbanes-Oxley.
So just a couple of quick comments. I think what's hard right now is to distinguish between the cyclical and the secular factors. I talked about the secular decline. It's real, okay? It's been going on for a while. I think many of the things you're talking about are associated with the current crisis and are the cyclical downturn. Do I think part of the reason job creation has been so slow to recover in this recovery is indeed startups are down, young small businesses are not creating jobs in the way that they normally do. Can I say in past recessions, young business startups and young small businesses didn't take such a big hit. They took an enormous hit this time. I think they've taken a hit in part for reasons that you're talking about. I think we're in an environment right now where I actually think young and small businesses and venture capitalists and so on, everybody's still very cautious, all right, for all kinds of complicated reasons we're going to run out of time to kind of talk about. I think that's more of a associated with the cyclical decline. I sort of say in terms of the theme in the panel, I'm worried about the current environment. Obviously, I'm worried about how long it's going to take us to recover from this downturn. It may take a while because of the kind of things you're talking about. And I'm actually more worried about the secular decline.
Thank you all. I'm just going to answer your question by a little bit. Two major sources of seed capital: credit cards, home equity loans. Both went away. That can probably explain a lot of the decline in seed capital, which didn't come from venture capitalists, but came from, and the third place it came from was relatives whose pension assets also declined a lot recently. Those three things probably explain a lot about lack of seed capital than all sorts of fancy things you could come up with, like Sarbanes-Oxley. Anyway, thank you all very much. Good.